I hate it. I hate
Spider crawl?
I don't even like the peak contraction. I don't get anything out of it. I've never liked it. Like that whole squeeze shit, I never liked this.
You heard it here.
Yeah.
This man is fully lengthened partial pilled, fam. This shit busting for real, for real.
FR, S tier, Pepe the Frog emojis. Am I young yet?
All right, Grandpa. Welcome back. Dr. Milo Wolf here with Wolf Coaching. Once again, with Dr. Mike.
Hello.
After talking about traumatic childhood experiences last time, one thing I wasn't sure whether we should touch on, but
That's what my pastor said.
And then he did.
Of course.
And then you've been scarred since.
Nah, I was fine.
I
had a good time.
Point of pride.
Yeah. He chose me among all the other kids.
I think he's found himself. And I've found out some stuff about range of motion. So we've both found something. And what I think we need to discuss is whether we both agree about how deep to go. You know?
God. Pastor John? Oh, sorry. That's that again.
Hey, man. Dreams.
Yeah, every night.
Moist, even.
They were wet dreams every night.
Anyways, range of motion.
Yes.
How deep should you go? Do we agree? Should you still get a peak squeeze and finish strong? Should you get a good thrust in?
Ooh.
You know?
I think you've mistaken me for Brett Contreras.
That is
all love and jokes, my friend.
Shout out, Brett. Some of the exercises he puts out actually
the most innovative, and you'll never run out of variation. Yep. And you can't do front foot elevated Smith machine lunges like we do forever. So you got to do other stuff. I love.
They are fucking great though.
They're
because
S tier or whatever.
They allow for a good stretch.
Aha.
And so we need to discuss whether you think full range of motion, lengthened partials. What do you think is better for hypertrophy and why?
The proper answer I would give is a little complicated, but I would say we haven't not enough convincing evidence on holistic regional hypertrophy to rule out the possibility that lengthened partials don't exact a huge amount of general hypertrophy, but a massive amount of, let's say, distal regional hypertrophy, and that full range of motion may be able to give you a more uniform hypertrophy. I'm not sure if that's true or false. You may know better than me if that's true or false. I just don't think we have compelling evidence yet. And because your muscles are literally designed by evolution to move through a full range of motion, their entire range of motion, I suspect that there's some inclusion of a whole range of motion for whole muscle hypertrophy may be a net benefit. However, we also know another very important thing, that long muscle length training, and independently of that, just stretching by itself, are very robust hypertrophic stimulators. And I'm not going to assume some kind of religious ideology, hashtag team full ROM, that you got to do full ROM. The only reason that a lot of people do full ROM is just ASMR, just obsessive compulsive disorder. Like if you go to here and then you stop, they're like, but you didn't do this part. Like, I think you honestly need psychiatric help.
Congratulations. You just went from tying your ego to the weight on the bar to tying your ego to the technique in full range of motion.
Yes.
You did well.
Better than weight on the bar, but...
Is it?
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Right? I guess better than weight on the bar at the expense of technique.
Yeah.
But if you tie your ego to good technique, I think that's probably good. Yeah. However, what is good technique?
Exactly.
So I'll say this. Here's my current position on it. I would say, if I have to be a betting man, my current position, which absolutely could change, that's how science works, I would say is aim to get mostly a full range of motion, but heavily biased to accentuating exposure to tension at long muscle lengths. So for example, if you want to design the ultimate chest press machine, I would say that it should allow you to lock out and allow you to get the deepest stretch ever. But the loading should be very small here and very large here. That's how I would surmise my current best. That's how I try to do most of my training. But based on largely your literature and your analysis of literature, some of which you're primarily involved on, in many exercises, I no longer do that peak contraction thing because I think it's just marginally not worth it. In my experience, I get bigger pumps, bigger soreness, and seemingly better growth and rep strength over time if I don't necessarily lock out. So I used to do calf training in that kind of ASMR way where like the peak contraction matters and so does the deep stretch.
And then come all the way up to the peak contraction where you are up on the balls of your feet. That is how you know that you've done a good rep.
It's where you look most jacked, so really you can't avoid it.
Right.
For the reels, you know?
Especially if you're looking in the mirror and you're doing alternating one-arm curls. Like, if you don't do this part,
What's the point, bro?
Where is Gold's Gym? You couldn't even find it on a map. I used to focus as much on the deep stretch in the calves as I would on that peak contraction. And I always noted that in the peak contraction, like the mind-muscle connection, and as we defined it at RP, mind-muscle connection is a profound burn of the muscle or profound ribbing tension. I wasn't getting that with the peak contraction. It was kind of like, I get a peak contraction, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of stimulus being driven there, so I never loved it, but I did it because it was a whole range of motion. And then when I saw your literature, you and I talked a few times, I gave it some thought, I experimented with lengthened bias training in my calves. So now I don't lock out fully on my calf, like leg press calves, I don't lock out fully. I come all the way down for a deep stretch, which I now hold for 2 to 4 seconds at the bottom. Then I come up most of the way, maybe 65% of the way down, and then come back in with the eccentric control. My calves reliably, for any given number of sets, more pump, more sore, visibly more growth, and way more strength gains to the point I have 5 plates on the calf press. What the fuck is going on? I'm going to tear my calf tendons apart. It just seems to work better on every single line of evidence. Yeah. So I just don't lock out my calf stuff anymore. Could I be missing out on some hypothetical benefit? Some fraction of the musculature only gets activated maximally during lockout? I think that's likely. But on the net aggregate of muscle hypertrophy, should you still be biasing the majority of your training into lengthened position? Yes. And I'll make another argument from a slightly different perspective. Whatever range of motion you're doing in your exercises, if you're missing out on a huge tension stretch part, I think you're making a really big mistake. So if someone's doing full range of motion, I don't care that they're locking out all the way. I'd be like, that's okay. But if they're locking out all the way, but they're going down to here and then they're coming back up, I'm like, all right, dude, if you're gonna bias anything, bias the bottom.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as far as technique goes, biasing lengthened position via partials or via full range of motion seems to be one of the only things we really empirically know. It's like, hey, or at least have a very high degree of confidence in. It's like, if you're missing the stretch, you are likely reducing how much hypertrophy you're going to see.
Totally. So, and there's no counterexample to that that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so to touch on 2 things you brought up. There was a lot there. Very good take on the whole, I would say. One is...
My pastor also had a good take on my whole... What? Please continue, Milo. I'm sorry. Nightmares from yesteryear.
I'm daydreaming now. 2 men. Well...
Let's not get canceled. Keep going.
Indeed. There's 2 things you mentioned that I want to bring up. One is regional hypertrophy. So I'm aware of about 25 studies, I think on the dot, in fact, if not 27 now with the calf research, that have looked at a more lengthened form of training and compared it to a more shortened form of training. That could be an isometric hold at longer muscle lengths versus an isometric hold at shorter muscle lengths. Could be a partial at longer muscle lengths or a partial at shorter muscle lengths. Could be a full range of motion versus a lengthened partial. Most of these studies don't just measure hypertrophy at one side. They measure hypertrophy at more proximal and more distal sites. I recently went through a lot of these studies again, and this is a rough estimate, so don't come for me in the comments if you've read all of these studies, which I don't think you have, but regardless.
Then see you in the comments.
Yeah, then respect. I will see you in the comments on the battlefield.
Comments at all.
Indeed. But across 25 studies that I've read, I think 2 have found marginally more hypertrophy at the proximal site from shortened training. Every other study pretty much that I can think of has found similar or more hypertrophy from lengthened training, even at proximal sites. With that prevalence of greater growth from shortened training in proximal areas being so low, I'm almost inclined to think it's more of a type 1 error.
I would say 2 out of 27 is good evidence for something not existing.
Exactly.
It's better evidence for it not existing than it existing.
Like with a normal distribution around a positive
you would
effect,
expect that.
You would have some effects that are...
I would say if you never found it, you would be curious about like study
bias or something going on, you know? 100%. And so if anything with the regional hypertrophy thing, it may be an absence of evidence that we don't have the studies that look at sufficiently proximal sites for very good reasons. When you're ultrasonic muscle, sometimes you don't see
totally
shit, you know?
Or like a 5-site analysis across the entire bicep. We don't really see that much. So when people say we understand regional hypertrophy robustly, we don't understand it robustly. We understand it as like one or the other. I've seen a few studies where there's 3 areas examined, but those are highly uncommon. So I really think that lengthened bias training is probably king, and shortened bias training is probably a fucking waste of time. But as a proper scientific thinker, I have to say that the totality evidence is not so powerful that I'm willing to completely rule it out. But in my own practice, when I do incline presses now, I just stop here, and someone's like, why don't you do this? And I'm like, why don't you tell me why you think to do this? And there's no good answer.
Sure. So to come to that point in that case, as a scientific thinker, let's break down the evidence on lengthened partials versus full range of motion. I think since we last spoke, there have been 2 more studies on the topic. So there's now 5 studies, one of which is unpublished. But I'll mention it here as well because they have done previous studies in the leg curl and the push down versus overhead extension. One study on leg press, Workhausen and colleagues, they found the same growth between a super small lengthened partial, 9 degrees of knee extension, versus a relatively more full range of motion. That's the only study where they've seen similar growth between a lengthened partial approach and a full range of motion. Notably, this was in concentric only training. So it's not even like
weird.
It's a sort of not very ecologically valid.
Yeah.
So I would say consider that study as like, oh, okay, maybe the effect isn't as strong as we thought, or what have you, or maybe with super small ranges of motion, it doesn't matter. But that's the first study. All 4 other studies have found a fair bit more hypertrophy from lengthened partials compared to a full range of motion. The most recent study that hasn't been published yet is by Milo and colleagues, where they compared doing lengthened partials, so half reps in the stretch position, on the multi-hip machine to doing a full range of motion, just missing that peak squeeze. So they went to 0 degrees of hip flexion, not hyperextending the hip. And they saw about twice the hypertrophy in the glute max, over twice in fact. They saw twice the hypertrophy in several of the, well, in all of the hamstring heads measured, around twice, a bit less than twice in some, a bit more than twice in others. So essentially around twice the hypertrophy in all of the hip extensor musculature measured from an RDL or hip hinge-like motion. So that's, to me, very compelling evidence. Then we have another study that came out since the meta-analysis by Cassiano and colleagues, which was a calf one, where they compared lengthened partials, the bottom half of the rep, not getting that peak squeeze, to top half partials, just a peak squeeze essentially, to full range of motion, and they saw about twice as much hypertrophy in both sites measured, lateral and medial calf, so inside and outside of the calf, for lengthened partials versus full range of motion. So again, around twice as much hypertrophy. Then we have the 2 remaining studies by Godo and colleagues, which was more of a mid-length partial. So they kind of compared doing mid to long-length partial, kind of like from here to like here maybe, thereabouts, around the mid-length, but a bit length and biased, to a full range of motion, seeing more hypertrophy from that, but I wouldn't count this as a strong piece of evidence because it was more of a mid-length partial, right? And then the final study was a study by Pedrosa and colleagues, which has been talked about a lot, which was a leg extension one, where they compared a full range of motion to bottom half partials, to top half partials, to doing both the bottom half and the top half partials for half their volume respectively. Now you'd think if there's something to shorten position, but there's also something to lengthen partials, maybe the leg doing the bottom half partials and the top half partials separately would potentially see a bit more growth in certain areas. And by and large, they measured a variety of sites for a variety of muscle groups of the quads. That didn't really happen. Generally, the most favorable hypertrophy was still seen in the lengthened partial only group. And so we have these 5 studies where you often see hypertrophy as large as twice as much. And in fact, we have a study coming up that's being published right now looking at the impact of hip angle during the leg extension on quad hypertrophy, seeing that the muscle that's being lengthened more, the rectus femoris, that's impacted through hip positioning, when that was being lengthened more by extending your hips on a leg extension, grew between 50% more at the distal site to 170% more at the proximal site. So even in this case, at the proximal site, where you'd think, oh, maybe shortened training is better, lengthened training led to like nearly 3 times as much growth. And as I mentioned in the overall data, we have, I think, 2 findings or so roughly that find a meaningful amount more hypertrophy from shortened training in that proximal area. Equally, when you're talking about the effect of shortened training versus lengthened training on proximal hypertrophy versus distal hypertrophy, mechanistically, if there was something to that, you would expect somewhat of a dose-response relationship, where the more shortened the training is, the better it should be for proximal growth. And the more lengthened it is, the better it should be for distal growth. And there's kind of a spectrum, right?
Oh, I'm on the spectrum.
Hey, aren't we all? Autism gang.
When you're like, aren't we all? I like have a very poor reaction to the joke. I don't know. Like, oh yeah, there it is.
Anyways, and so when we don't see that in the literature, because we have examples of relatively more proximal measurement sites and pretty shortened training and not seeing more hypertrophy, I'm inclined to think that if we are not observing any semblance of dose-response relationship there, and we're still seeing similar or greater hypertrophy typically with lengthened training even at proximal sites, I'm skeptical. And the final thing is, outside of that research, the research looking at lengthened versus shortened training and looking at actual hypertrophy, so the most direct form of research there is, I'm just not aware of any good evidence that would point us towards certain areas of the muscle growing more, even mechanistically. Like EMG, as we both know, as a predictor for hypertrophy, unless you meet a number of conditions, I don't think it really works.
Yeah.
You know?
I have a whole video about like 6 ways EMG sucks.
Yep. Then hey, if you want a paper about that, check out the review paper by Vygotsky and colleagues from 2023.
Cited heavily in that video, by the way. I corresponded with Andrew.
Beautiful.
Like, hey, am I saying this
Andrew's
right?
a genius.
Yeah,
You hear me?
that's great. Yeah.
I don't know. I hear the regional hypertrophy concern from a very, 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 very conservative place, but I just don't think the evidence supports it.
Yeah. It's a concern mostly it's a procedural concern,
Sure.
so that we don't overvalue the initial wave of evidence.
I get that.
I've seen a lot. Remember, one thing we have to account for is publication bias.
Well, there's ways to assess.
There are ways to assess publication.
And we have assessed it with the final result, and it was pretty good.
There's no perfect way to assess for it.
Oh, for sure.
Because people can just not choose to release certain results because X,
100%.
right? So there's a degree of guarding I have to do for intellectual kind of holistic approach, but to put it in internet gamer meme terms,
now we're talking.
Top-end partials are shaking RN.
They're mid,
yes. Or they're punching the air.
Kind of cringe, TBH.
Yeah, exactly. S tier, whatever.
Tier list.
I'm a masturbation addict that plays Dungeons and Dragons. I got it. You said it all. Basically, I think that the evidence is starting to become incrementally more compelling that lengthened partials, definitely, just any sort of emphasis on the lengthened position is a good thing. For me personally, because I don't train purely for hypertrophy, I train for function as well because of jiu-jitsu. I have to do, in most cases, the whole range of motion because it happens to be in jiu-jitsu. You have to be strong through a full range of motion. So I still do more of that. If I was training for pure hypertrophy and incrementally more as the evidence comes out, I'm doing more and more lengthened bias training. Another thing is, if we find out that the lengthened position is 10% more hypertrophic than the shortened position, it's more deep than that, and even more biased towards lengthen makes sense, and here's how. You, in any one set, have a certain amount of fatigue that you could expend until the set ends. If you do that set mostly in the stretch position, the amount of total stimulus is quite high. If you expend fatigue in a not-so-great position, then you essentially can't do as much positive work. It's like
water it down.
100%. Yep. It's like if you have $50 to spend and you want to see a couple of movies, when you buy popcorn, now you're seeing 2 movies instead of 3. Mm-hmm. So how much do you want the popcorn versus the movies? There's limited resources. Here's another thing. The fatigue imposed on especially the eccentric component of a lengthened position is not nearly as neurologically fatiguing as the concentric component of a shortened partial. This is really hard. This, I don't want to say you can kind of smoke a cig while you do it, but it kind of takes care of itself to some marginal extent. So if you're insisting on fucking locking out everything all the time, you're costing more reps you could have done in the lengthened position, and you are costing yourself a lot of cumulative fatigue over time. So I think biasing the majority of your training to lengthened positions is even more advantageous than would appear just on examining what is better to train in weird isolated laboratory conditions. So I'm even supporting your point even more than you were supporting your point.
I thought we were supposed to beef it.
Is that good enough?
That's odd. I think that's
my spirit animal,
beef in the YouTube industry.
My spirit animal is the miniature dachshund. It looks adorable.
It's adorable. Bro, they bark so much. They're like the barkiest dogs ever.
They also bite. They have huge bite rates. Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
They can't do much damage because of the size of your foot.
Yeah.
But they're mean fucking dogs.
They also have back problems pretty often because of their
they're too long.
Yeah.
Oh no.
It'd be like that.
They need lengthened partials.
They do. Everything's
a lengthened partial when you're a dachshund, though, if you think about it.
That is true. I'm thinking surgery right now.
Damn.
Yeah. You ever think about why we're bipedal nowadays?
Yeah, why? I'm tired of it.
Why use our hands for anything? Just walk on the floor.
I haven't used my hands in years. I have butlers for that.
That's true. To finish off this video, I just want to give a couple caveats. I think we agree on most things. Well, one question first before I move on to the caveats, because there's one final thing I want to ask. How do you reconcile from an empirical perspective or from a applicability of scientific findings perspective, using lengthened biased forms of training versus just straight up using lengthened partials? Because ultimately, most of what we study in research isn't really a lot of all right, let's pause in lengthened position, or let's really control the eccentric. So while I recommend these things as kind of like adjunct tools to emphasize the stretch, the most direct way of applying the research that we have, and thus the most surefire way to get the additional hypertrophy we observe in these studies, is to mimic the conditions of the study. And that is to say, to use lengthened partials, as opposed to controlling the stretch more or what have you. How come you prefer to use those, what I consider secondary ways of emphasizing the stretch?
Mm-hmm. because you don't grow from specific conditions. You grow from underlying mechanisms. Studies are worthless unless they indicate underlying mechanisms of action, because studies also are not on you, the subject. They're in a different training age. They're in a different group of people. I'm not a collegiate 22-year-old male, etc.
But the issue is we don't understand those mechanisms yet. So we can certainly try and get at them through rational thinking, and that's something.
Sure.
But until we have more evidence from these studies in the same cohorts, in the same actual study, I tend to think that we should take the safer bet, so to speak. Not so much make inferential jumps based on our rational thinking about what mechanisms might be involved, but more so try and directly apply the research until we have a more solid foundation for these are the mechanisms. And that's one of the big gaps in the research, is we don't fully understand the mechanisms yet. People online, certain people, will claim we understand them fully yet. We don't. All we know to an extent is that it causes more growth. There can be the involvement of different things, but so to me, until we understand those mechanisms more profoundly, I just think we should apply them
I hear that.
verbatim.
I really don't like verbatim applications from studies. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble that way. Leucine threshold, we got into a lot of trouble that way. A bunch of other situations. Though I hear that it's a safe bet from rationalizing why you're doing something. What I like to do is try to take guesses at why that thing is affecting the thing and replicate the conditions to a high degree. I don't think you need one-to-one replication.
I agree. You're not going to run fucking only calf raises in your program because that's what they did in the study.
100%.
But
100%.
As close to it as you can be while still respecting other fundamental principles of programming.
For sure. So there's nothing wrong with lengthened partials. I think they're great. But what I would say is if you are highly lengthened biasing your full range of motion training, the argument against doing that becomes to be quite limited. Here's another thing. If you are making exercises with resistance curves that heavily favor the lengthened position, let's say a free motion curl where it's super crazy hard here and really easy here, you might be entering into essentially a rest pause situation where from here to here, I mean, you can do one set and then fail, and it's a great productive set, and you do another set later. But if you go through a full range of motion, but this part's really easy, you're actually resting here. You can get more total reps within a given set and more exposures to tension in that productive area because you're essentially taking longer rest pauses between. And so set to set, like once I'm plugged into a machine, I want to fucking go. And then I can actually do a better job stimulating hypertrophy if I have that rest pause system built in. So if I'm, for example, on a leg press, if I have a machine that's really, really tough at the bottom and easy at the top, if I go through a full range of motion on that machine, I get 25 reps instead of 15. Is that a big difference? It could be. It could not be. I don't think it matters much. And because for me, the functionality, the tracking variable is a thing that can be resolved really well. To me, it's those things should be expected on a theoretical basis to cause roughly similar hypertrophy. But because for me, function is still important, and I think the tracking using full range of motion is very marginal, but nonetheless important, then you end up in a situation where for some exercises, if it's heavily biased towards the stretch, getting that little P contraction gives you that little break. I think it comes out roughly equal and may in some cases be advantage to actually get that little pulse at the top. But maybe not.
Gotcha. I have 3 thoughts on that, and then I'll close off the video. One is the research on rest pause for hypertrophy isn't all that compelling. So on principle, I wouldn't think rest pausing is something you need to be chasing in your training. So like that's not a sufficiently compelling reason as a standalone for me to say, let's do this full range of motion to get more reps in as a quasi rest pause technique. The second thing is, I think that technique is going to be great to an extent for increasing time efficiency because you're essentially shifting the goalpost of failure, right? If all you did was the bottom half and you're under relatively constant tension, your failure point might occur after 15 reps like that. If you're doing a full range of motion and doing a quasi rest pause, you're extending or going past that theoretical failure point with that range of motion and getting more and more reps, essentially past failure in a theoretical or framework sense. And so while that would cause more growth on a per set basis, I don't think it would necessarily increase SFR, for example. I think it might be a similar SFR or slightly less or what have you. If you generally assume that there is a negative SFR trade-off when you go closer and closer and potentially past failure, right? I personally don't think that necessarily. I think training closer to failure is probably a good thing for hypertrophy. But I think that if you think that there is a trade-off between how close to failure you go and how much fatigue you accrue versus how much additional stimulus you get, it may be a consideration that, hey, first of all, you're not getting much up here as those stimulus goes. And second of all, by going past that theoretical failure point, you may be getting more additional fatigue that isn't worth a slight increase in stimulus. But by and large, I agree, and I think, honestly, it probably doesn't make a huge difference. In an exercise that's already...
make a huge difference.
In an exercise that's already super length and biased, a dumbbell fly.
Sure.
Does it really matter whether you do the top half of the rep or not?
Sure.
I don't really think it does. The exercise is already a lengthened partial, essentially, in its foundation.
100%.
And so I think that a lot of the benefits from this research can likely be accrued through wise exercise selection.
That's a huge one.
That's a topic for a video we'll do on the OP channel, I suspect.
Very likely. And also, like, a good illustration of that is the spider curl, where you bend over on a bench and do this. Is like, variation's great, and for some people it works, but it's generally dog shit exercise.
Oh, for sure.
Versus like a lying dumbbell curl.
It feels sweet, though.
I hate it. I hate
spider curl?
I don't even like the peak contraction. I don't get anything out of it. I've never liked it. Like that whole squeeze shit, I never liked this.
You heard it here.
Yeah.
This man is fully lengthened partial pilled, fam. This shit busting for real, for real.
FR, S tier, Pepe the Frog emojis. Am I young yet?
All right, Grandpa. It's been a great video.
Tried.
It's been an honor. If you liked the video, please comment, like, subscribe. If you haven't already, and I'm sure you have already, go subscribe to the RP channel. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.